everyone, welcome to the community classroom. This is Dr. Tracey McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator, and we are continuing with our political psychology series. And what we're going to be focusing on is the restorative justice process. Many people are expressing impatience related to the restorative justice process, and particularly sort of frustration related to HR 40 and this idea of a commission to study reparations. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of the myths and miseducation related to Japanese internment and the reparations process, because many people believe that the Japanese people were subjected to internment, and then once released they automatically receive reparations. And what you're going to see based upon the timeline is that it wasn't that cut and dry, that quick and that easy. And so what we're going to look at this timeline for restoration for that particular situation so that you can compare and contrast it with the HR 40 situation. So we're going to look at the use of reparations study commissions and the commission that was used for Japanese reparations, and it's very similar to the HR 40 process. We're going to look at the time for restoration and some of the types of restorative justice that were provided to the Japanese people. And we are also going to look at some of the parameters and limitations that were imposed on the receipt of reparations so that you can see how it fits in with some of the parameters that are asserted related to HR 40. And as always, if this appears on anything other than Dr. Tracey McCarthy, it is stolen and unauthorized. Let's get started. Now, some individuals may be unfamiliar with the issue of reparations related to Japanese Americans, and so we'll just give a little bit of background here. In 1988, the Civil Liberties Act was enacted, and it was a United States federal law that granted reparations to Japanese Americans who had been interned by the United States government during World War II. And the law provided for not only compensation, but also an apology. And the government basically stated that the actions of the government were based upon race prejudice and hysteria related to the war and a failure of political leadership for the country at that time. The law was also restrictive, and so the law was restricted to American citizens of Japanese descent or legal permanent residents who were ethnically Japanese who had been taken from their homes and placed in these internment camps. People were forced to relocate. And so there was that limitation. So it did not include other individuals such as Japanese individuals who had been taken from their homes in Latin America, like Peru. Those individuals were not covered by this reparations law. And this is regardless of whether they remained in the United States or they returned to different areas of Latin America, and so, or if they were even deported to Japan after the war. And so it was a very exclusive law that related to a very specific group of people who were harmed by this internment. In many of the discussions related to reparations, there is a belief that the Japanese reparations occurred very quickly. And so many people have been comparing and contrasting the dynamics related to Japanese reparations and reparations for slavery and Jim Crow. And so it's important for people to understand the difference between the facts and the fictions related to the Japanese reparations timeline. And also many people are saying that the study should be sidestepped and that we need to go directly to reparations. But as we've discussed before, not only is a study necessary, but there's also the need for a truth commission in this particular situation. There are a number of dynamics that are going on and have gone on historically, and if those issues are not addressed, you're not going to see reparations happen as expeditiously as people would like to see it happen. So anyway, so let's look at this timeline very quickly, and then we're going to get into some specifics. And so you can see in 1942 there was the internment. There was not a study commission until 1980, and then there was a study that took place, and then there was not a law enacted until 1988 for reparations. And so you're talking about from 1942 to 1988 to even get to the point of addressing reparations. And so that you can see what the bill looked like, the resolution looked like, you can see a summary here. So I pulled out some excerpts so that you can just kind of get a basic idea of what the end result was. And so one of the things that occurred was a declaration that a grave injustice had been done to citizens and permanent residents of Japanese ancestry. And this grave injustice included evacuation, relocation, and internment of the civilians during World War II. And what was also noted was that the individuals suffered grave injustices. They suffered a number of damages, and there had been no compensation, no appropriate compensation for the injustices. And many would argue that there is no actual adequate compensation that you can provide to a group of people for what took place. And so the other thing that took place was that Congress apologized on behalf of the nation for those wrongs. And this was similar to what took place with Alaskan natives. And so this law was fairly comprehensive in terms of dealing with reparations for individuals who were injured and suffered injustice, whether we're talking about emotional or economic injustice during that time period. And finally, what's important about this is that there was a recognition that there was no remedy for the injustice except an act of Congress. Now let's quickly look at some of the results of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. One result was that there was a request from the president to provide pardons for individuals who'd been convicted of violating laws related to the internment period. Many people refused to go along with the injustices, and there were legal consequences for those refusals. There was also a request that the federal government look at this issue of restitution related to people losing their positions and their statuses and their entitlements during this internment period. And as you can see, there was a fund established for reparations. You can see that toward the middle there. And there were parameters placed on this fund and indicators for when this fund needed to be terminated. And so there was a time limit for it in terms of these appropriations and the authorizations for the appropriations. And down below you can see that the Attorney General was directed to identify and locate each individual who would be entitled to reparations. And so there was a fund established, and there were parameters around who would receive these funds, and there was also the dynamic of identifying and locating each individual. Hence, there's no need for there to be any random people online creating any types of registries. It's not going to happen that way. The government will be the entity that establishes the formal registry. So we're not talking about people taking rolls of their family members and their community groups. We're talking about the holistic creation of a formal registry, and that will take place with the government. And so the other thing that took place was that there was a determination made that when people accepted the reparations, this would stand as what's known as satisfaction and accord related to any claims related to the internment. And so people need to understand that when they're thinking about reparations for slavery and Jim Crow, you need to think about it comprehensively, and you need to consider each injustice and what would constitute restorative justice. And so it's very important to think that way, because once reparations occurs, the understanding generally is that there won't be any future claims related to that same injustice. And some additional notations related to the law. There was a requirement that all of the documents, all of the testimony, all of the records that were received by the Commission be maintained by the archivist for the United States. And so that is in the U.S. archives. And so it is available for public research. So if anyone wants to look at that information, to use it in terms of formulating ideas and thoughts and plans related to HR 40, that information is available. Another thing to note is that there was a trust established for the benefit of individuals who were Alaskan natives. And so the trust was established for people who were elderly and disabled and seriously ill, and for students who needed scholarship assistance. So there was a trust established, and so that's another way to think about reparations. It doesn't just have to be this one-time thing. Sometimes a trust may be established for the benefit of individuals throughout generations. And again, you see some exclusionary dynamics going on. So there was the recognition that this did not apply to other Indian tribes. And so this was specifically for this particular group of people. Now, being able to look at that timeline and also see some of the snippets related to the law, this should allow people to be able to distinguish between the myths and the realities related to what happened with the Japanese American internment situation. And then you can compare and contrast that with what is taking place in terms of HR 40 and the current discussions related to reparations for slavery and Jim Crow. Now, this also should help people to normalize this idea of a study commission. And so this is a normal part of any reparations process. Again, for this situation, there really needs to be a truth commission in addition to or as a part of the general study commission for HR 40 or for the companion bill that is going to be introduced in the Senate. And coming up, we're going to be talking about vision, goals, objectives, and outcomes related to the reparations discussions. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care and see you soon.